The chamber was thick with tension before a single word left her lips. Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of a man who had grown accustomed to being untouchable. His tone dripped with condescension as he rattled off his interpretation of the Constitution, each phrase delivered like a lecture meant to remind the room of his power. For a moment, it seemed like just another hearing, another exercise in posturing and platitudes. Then Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Judge, with all due respect," she said, her gaze unwavering, "you're misquoting the very text you claim to defend." The silence was instant. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Even the cameras seemed to tighten their focus, hungry to capture what everyone felt in that instant. Something had shifted. This wasn't going to be a polite back and forth. This was about to become a confrontation. Kavanaugh blinked, startled but trying not to show it. His smirk faltered as Crockett continued, her words sharp and precise. "Article 1 isn't a suggestion. It's the foundation. You don't get to cherry-pick the Constitution when it suits you, then ignore it when it doesn't." A low murmur rippled across the gallery. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority wasn't in volume, but in clarity, in the way her every sentence landed with the weight of undeniable truth. The judge shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie as though trying to shrug off the pressure. But the air in the room had already changed. People leaned forward, sensing they were watching the kind of exchange that would play back on every screen across the country before the day was done. This was no longer his stage. It was hers. And yet, even as the room buzzed with shock, Crockett wasn't finished. She had only set the stage. What came next would do more than challenge his arguments. It would flip the entire debate on its head.
From the very beginning, Brett Kavanaugh believed this would be routine. He had walked into the hearing chamber cloaked in authority, the robe of a Supreme Court justice granting him an aura of untouchable dominance. To him, the hearing was little more than a stage to rehearse well-polished lines about the Constitution, to assert his reading of the law as though it were the only reading possible. He expected nods of approval, polite acknowledgments, perhaps a few scripted questions that he could easily dismiss with a lawyer's practiced grin. But Jasmine Crockett had not come to play her part in that performance. Her preparation was different, her presence deliberate. She carried not just books of law, but the voices of people who knew what it meant to be silenced, ignored, or misrepresented. And when she interrupted him in that opening moment, it became clear. This would not be another theater of deference. This was confrontation, live and unfiltered. Why did it matter so much? Because what hung in the balance wasn't just a legal footnote or an abstract principle. It was the very question of how America interprets its own soul. Kavanaugh represented a vision of the Constitution frozen in time, wielded as a weapon to preserve the powerful. Crockett represented another vision, one alive, breathing, and fiercely inclusive, rooted in the belief that democracy only thrives when every citizen's dignity is protected. Viewers could feel that collision of worlds in real time. On one side, a man who had spent his career shielded by privilege, expecting the world to bend around his narrative. On the other, a black woman, sharp-witted and unflinching, determined to remind him and everyone listening that the Constitution does not belong to judges alone. It belongs to the people. Generations collided in that chamber. Kavanaugh spoke as though the founder's words were locked in amber, immune to change, immune to the struggles of those who came after. Crockett countered with the lived reality of modern America, one where the promise of equality is still unfinished, still urgent. She wasn't merely arguing law, she was arguing for the future, one in which America finally makes good on its oldest promises. And the audience knew it. Across living rooms, classrooms, and scrolling social feeds, people leaned in. The exchange didn't feel like politics as usual. It felt like a referendum on what America would become. Was the Constitution a shield for entrenched power, or was it a living covenant meant to expand rights and protect the vulnerable? Viewers could feel that collision of worlds in real time. On one side, a man who had spent his career shielded by privilege, expecting the world to bend around his narrative. On the other, a black woman, sharp-witted and unflinching, determined to remind him and everyone listening that the Constitution does not belong to judges alone. It belongs to the people. Generations collided in that chamber. Kavanaugh spoke as though the founder's words were locked in amber, immune to change, immune to the struggles of those who came after. Crockett countered with the lived reality of modern America, one where the promise of equality is still unfinished, still urgent. She wasn't merely arguing law, she was arguing for the future, one in which America finally makes good on its oldest promises. And the audience knew it. Across living rooms, classrooms, and scrolling social feeds, people leaned in. The exchange didn't feel like politics as usual. It felt like a referendum on what America would become. Was the Constitution a shield for entrenched power, or was it a living covenant meant to expand rights and protect the vulnerable? The hashtags began forming before the hearing even ended. Clips were clipped, tweets drafted, captions written. Everyone watching knew this wasn't just about law. It was about America's future. And Kavanaugh, perhaps for the first time in a long time, seemed rattled. His brow tightened, his responses sharpened with impatience, the easy confidence slipping away. Crockett had pulled him out of the comfort of legal abstractions and forced him into the raw terrain of principle and morality. The balance of power in the room shifted. The air was thick with anticipation. And that's when the tension boiled over.
To understand why Brett Kavanaugh carried himself with such certainty in that hearing room, one must first trace the road that led him there. His journey was not a tale of hardship or struggle, but rather one of doors opened long before he ever knocked. Born into privilege, Kavanaugh's life was a polished corridor lined with elite schools, powerful networks, and the quiet assurance that he belonged in the halls of power. From Georgetown Prep to Yale, he was surrounded by the unspoken promise that success was not only possible, but expected. Privilege shaped not just his opportunities, but his outlook. In college and later in Washington's legal circles, he learned the language of authority, the confident cadence, the dismissive smirk, the way of carrying himself as if challenges were inconveniences rather than battles to be won. Those who disagreed with him weren't equals, they were obstacles. And it was that very attitude that the nation glimpsed during his own confirmation hearings years earlier. When faced with serious allegations, Kavanaugh did not respond with humility or the gravity the moment demanded. Instead, he lashed out, voice raised, temper flaring, painting himself as the victim of some grand conspiracy. Rather than demonstrate neutrality, he revealed bias. Rather than exude calm judicial temperament, he showed the country a man rattled, defensive, and unwilling to be questioned. Yet there he sat, years later, cloaked once more in authority, speaking as though none of that history mattered. He invoked the Constitution with the gravity of a man convinced of his own neutrality. But neutrality was the very thing his past contradicted. Time and again, his rulings leaned toward the powerful. Again and again, his sympathies seemed reserved for institutions rather than individuals, corporations rather than communities. The man claiming neutrality had a long trail as bias. It was arrogance veiled as scholarship, entitlement dressed as jurisprudence. For Kavanaugh, the Constitution was not a guide to empower the many, but a shield to preserve the status of the few. And in his world, questioning that perspective was nearly unthinkable. Contrast that with the woman seated across from him. Crockett had not been handed prestige. Her voice was not amplified by legacy or insulated by networks of power. She had fought for every inch of recognition, carried the weight of service, and earned her authority not by inheritance but by resilience. The visual contrast in that chamber spoke volumes.
Kavanaugh leaned on his status, his pedigree, the assumed deference that came with his title. Crockett leaned on lived experience, the credibility forged by serving communities that power too often ignores. And that was why their clash mattered so much. It wasn't merely a debate about law. It was a confrontation between two visions of America, one where privilege protects itself and one where service demands accountability. For Kavanaugh, every answer he gave was meant to reassert control, to remind everyone listening that he sat atop the hierarchy of interpretation. But each word carried the baggage of his past, the memory of his arrogance on national display, the hypocrisy of a man who demanded respect yet gave so little of it in return. Viewers remembered. They remembered the way he snarled during those confirmation hearings, the way he pointed fingers instead of offering clarity. They remembered the petulance, the defensiveness, the refusal to accept scrutiny. Those memories colored every word he spoke now, turning what he intended as authority into something else entirely, a reminder of why his credibility had always been questioned. The man across the table embodied arrogance, the assumption of power. The woman challenging him embodied humility, the earned strength of service. In that room, entitlement was finally being forced to answer to integrity. And though Kavanaugh didn't realize it yet, his privilege would not shield him here. But while Kavanaugh basked in status, Crockett's story was forged in fire.
Long before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped into the chamber to face Brett Kavanaugh, her story had already been shaped by a very different kind of courtroom, the courtroom of real life, where dignity is tested daily and justice is far from guaranteed. She was not born into wealth, nor groomed in the safe cocoon of elite institutions. Her path was one of relentless perseverance, of carrying burdens while refusing to be broken by them. Growing up, she watched her community struggle under the weight of systemic neglect. Schools underfunded, neighborhoods overlooked, promises of equality never fully delivered. These weren't distant policy debates. They were lived realities, pressing down on her family, her friends, her neighbors. And yet, instead of retreating, Crockett leaned forward. She pursued law not as a stepping stone to prestige, but as a tool for service. Every late night of study, every hurdle overcome was fueled not by entitlement, but by a vision that the law should serve ordinary people, not just the privileged few. Her career reflected that mission. She didn't seek the cushioned positions in corporate law that so many chase. Instead, she chose the path that demanded more sacrifice, public defense, community advocacy, standing beside those society too often pushed aside. For Crockett, the Constitution was not an abstract parchment to be admired from a distance. It was a living promise, a commitment to be tested, challenged, and expanded until it truly embraced all people. That service sharpened her. In courtroom after courtroom, she stood across from prosecutors who dismissed her clients as statistics. She stood before judges who barely concealed their impatience when she demanded fairness. And she stood beside families who walked into those rooms with little faith left in the system. Each battle hardened her resolve. Each small victory proved that persistence could carve openings where none seemed to exist. What emerged from those years was not only a skilled lawyer, but a woman deeply in tune with the heartbeat of communities left voiceless. She carried their stories with her, their struggles etched into her understanding of what justice must mean. This was not theory, it was life. That perspective followed her into public office. When she entered politics, it wasn't on the shoulders of dynastic donors or polished consultants. It was through the hands of everyday people who believed she represented something rare: authenticity. Her grassroots campaigns were built on the energy of volunteers, small-dollar donors, and neighbors who saw in her not a politician speaking at them, but one of their own speaking for them. Her rise was not meteoric, it was deliberate, hard-won. Every step forward came against resistance, yet every step made her sharper, more resilient.
And in the process, she became something more than just a representative. She became a symbol of possibility. That someone without privilege, without an elite pedigree, could walk into the highest halls of power and refuse to bow. It was this history that uniquely prepared her for the moment she would face in that chamber. Because when Brett Kavanaugh leaned on his status, Crockett leaned on experience. When he wielded entitlement, she wielded empathy. Where his path had been paved, hers had been fought for, stone by stone, against odds that would have crushed lesser spirits. That contrast was not just academic, it was visible in the way she carried herself. Calm but firm, confident but grounded. Every word she spoke was backed not by abstract training, but lived truth. She didn't need to posture, she didn't need to raise her voice. Her very presence was proof of what resilience looked like. And that resilience mattered now more than ever. Because in this hearing, she wasn't simply debating law. She was speaking for every person who had ever been silenced by power, every community overlooked by those who claimed neutrality while ruling against them. She was there not just Jasmine Crockett individual, but as the embodiment of something larger, the idea that dignity belongs to all and that the Constitution must answer to the people, not just the privileged. As the hearing unfolded, those watching sensed this deeper story. They weren't simply seeing a congresswoman questioning a justice. They were witnessing a collision of two Americas, one insulated, one persevering. And in that collision, Crockett's voice carried the weight of generations demanding recognition. Her struggles, her service, her resilience, these were not side notes. They were the reason she stood so strong when others might have faltered under the glare of Kavanaugh's authority. She knew too much of what was at stake to be rattled now. And when the two finally clashed, history was made.
The silence after Crockett's first interruption didn't last long. Brett Kavanaugh adjusted his posture, leaned toward the microphone, and gave a half-smile that carried more condescension than courtesy. His voice dropped into a rehearsed tone of authority, slow and deliberate, as though explaining the alphabet to a child. "Congresswoman," he said, "with all due respect, the Constitution has been interpreted for centuries by scholars far more experienced. Perhaps you misunderstand the framers' intent." It was the kind of dismissal he had relied on countless times before. A wave of the hand, a verbal pat on the head, a suggestion that his opponent was out of her depth. For years, that tactic had worked, but not this time. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or match his tone with anger. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on him, and responded with precision. "I don't misunderstand, Judge. I'm reading the same text you claim to revere. The difference is, I'm not filtering it through privilege." A ripple ran through the chamber. Some suppressed smiles. Others leaned forward, sensing the shift. The tension between them was no longer hidden. It was palpable, visible in the set of Kavanaugh's jaw and the unwavering calm in Crockett's gaze. He tried again. "Well, I can assure you that legal precedent—" But Crockett cut him off, not with volume, but with clarity. Precedent is not sacred when it cements injustice. The framers did not write perfection. They wrote a promise we are still struggling to fulfill. The air grew heavy. You could feel the power shift. Kavanaugh's voice sharpened, his carefully measured tone cracking into irritation. That's a rather simplistic view. Law is not about feelings or promises. It's about stability, consistency, restraint. Crockett leaned closer, her words deliberate. Stability for home, Judge? Consistency for home. Because if restraint means silencing the people who've never been heard, then your version of law is nothing more than oppression wrapped in Latin phrases. Gasps echoed. Even the stenographers hesitated in their typing, momentarily caught in the gravity of her words. Kavanaugh, visibly unsettled, shifted in his chair. For the first time in the exchange, the veneer of calm judicial authority slipped.
His answers came faster, harsher, each one aimed less at reasoning and more at regaining control. But Crockett refused to be pulled into his rhythm. She let him rush, let him stumble over his insistence that the law was fixed, rigid, unquestionable. And then, when the moment was ripe, she delivered her counterpoints with surgical precision, citing not just history, but people, cases, communities whose very existence contradicted his narrow view. "You call it restraint," she said. "I call it exclusion. You call it stability. I call it stagnation. The Constitution is not a fortress to keep people out. It is a foundation to build upon. And if you can't see that, then maybe neutrality isn't what you're practicing after all." The chamber trembled with unspoken energy. This was no longer a polite disagreement. This was a duel of visions laid bare before the nation. One man clinging to entitlement, one woman wielding truth with composure. Kavanaugh opened his mouth to retort, but the words faltered. His smirk had evaporated, his voice stripped of its easy confidence. And Crockett? She remained steady, her calm growing more powerful with every passing second. Commentators watching would later say you could feel the exact moment the tide turned, when Kavanaugh stopped looking like a towering authority and started looking like a man scrambling to defend himself. Then came the moment nobody saw coming. The chamber was already tense, but what came next transformed it into something unforgettable, a performance of truth so sharp it sliced through every layer of arrogance in the room. Crockett waited until Kavanaugh's latest rebuttal fizzled into awkward silence, then leaned in, her voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Judge," she began, "you keep insisting that neutrality means freezing the Constitution in the 18th century. But neutrality without justice is complicity. Tell me, where was your neutrality when communities of color were denied equal protection under the very laws you claim are sacred?" The words landed like the first clean jab in a prize fight. Kavanaugh blinked, mouth twitching, as though unsure whether to swat the comment away or rise to meet it. He tried to laugh, but the sound was hollow. Crockett didn't let him regain footing. She paused just long enough to let the silence sting, then continued, each phrase deliberate, each pause intentional. "You say the framers' intent is our guide. Do you mean the same framers who wrote liberty into law while shackling human beings in chains? Is that your idea of neutrality, or is it just selective memory?" Gasps. A murmur swept through the chamber. The reporter's pen scratched faster, cameras zoomed closer. For a moment, Kavanaugh froze, caught between indignation and discomfort. He tried to muster a reply, fumbling with phrases about respect for history and institutional continuity. But Crockett wasn't finished. She was only tightening the grip. She leaned back slightly, voice unwavering. "You call it continuity. I call it contradiction. You speak of stability, but what you really defend is inequality carved into precedent. That's not the Constitution. It's corruption wearing a robe." Another blow. The words hung heavy in the air, striking harder because of her composure. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The calm in her delivery made the force undeniable, like a boxer who doesn't waste energy on flailing, only lands clean, calculated punches. Kavanaugh's face reddened. He shuffled his papers, though everyone could see he wasn't reading. He was buying time. "Congresswoman, I don't think it's productive to—" Crockett cut in again, sharper this time. "No, Judge, what's unproductive is pretending bias disappears just because it wears the costume of legal tradition. What's unproductive is pretending that neutrality is possible when decisions consistently side with the powerful over the powerless." The chamber erupted in murmurs again, this time louder. It wasn't just Crockett's words. It was the spectacle of a Supreme Court justice visibly unraveling under scrutiny. Then came the line that would echo across social media within minutes, replayed like the knockout punch of the century. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, her voice low, piercing. You claim to be the guardian of the Constitution, but guardians protect, they don't exploit. And right now, Judge, you're not protecting the people, you're protecting yourself." The room went silent, dead silent. It was the kind of silence that happens not because no one is listening, but because everyone is holding their breath. Even Kavanaugh seemed to lose his words entirely, his practiced demeanor stripped away. Crockett let the silence linger. She didn't rush. She knew the weight of what she had just delivered. And when she finally continued, her words were even sharper. "The Constitution is not your inheritance to hoard. It is our inheritance to uphold. And if you cannot see the difference, then maybe the problem isn't with our understanding. Maybe the problem is with yours." The audience reaction was visceral. Some leaned back in awe, others whispered to one another, while in the digital world, clips of the exchange were already being drafted into captions like, "Crockett schools Kavanaugh," and "This is what truth sounds like." Each of Crockett's lines landed like a perfectly timed blow. First the jab about slavery, then the hook about precedent as corruption, then the uppercut about guardianship. And with each strike, Kavanaugh's composure cracked further. His voice stumbled. His attempts to interrupt grew weaker. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands restless on the desk. For once, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Crockett, by contrast, seemed untouchable. Her pauses were strategic, her gaze steady, her words carried by the certainty of someone not performing, but revealing. She wasn't just winning an argument, she was dismantling an illusion. And then, as if sealing the exchange with one final flourish, she leaned forward and delivered the line that would be remembered long after the hearing. "Neutrality without justice is not law. It is cowardice dressed as principle, and the American people deserve better than cowardice." It was the mic drop, the final devastating punch. The chamber buzzed with whispers, the kind of collective gasp that told everyone in the room they had just witnessed a turning point. Kavanaugh sat back, silent, his face flushed, his earlier arrogance dissolved into something closer to disbelief. The imbalance of power in the room was undeniable now. Crockett had taken the stage, and the so-called guardian of the Constitution had been left exposed, vulnerable, and shaken. But what happened after the exchange was even more explosive. The moment Jasmine Crockett dropped her final line, "Neutrality without justice is not law. It is cowardice dressed as principle," the chamber seemed to exhale all at once. But outside those four walls, the reaction was just beginning. Within minutes, the clip spread like wildfire. On Twitter, hashtags erupted, hashtag Crockett versus Kavanaugh, hashtag constitutional truth, hashtag justice not cowardice. Users replayed the exchange in looping videos, attaching captions like, "This is how you hold power accountable," and "History in the making." The platform's trending sidebar filled with Crockett's name, while Kavanaugh's trailed behind, an unspoken symbol of how the power dynamic had flipped. Over on TikTok, creators wasted no time. Edits layered Crockett's calm delivery over dramatic beats, her mic drop lines set to slow-motion cuts of Kavanaugh's faltering expression. One viral clip juxtaposed her quote about slavery with scenes from civil rights marches, making clear the generational resonance of her words. Another had teenagers reenacting the exchange, mocking Kavanaugh's dismissive tone before cutting back to Crockett's devastating rebuttals. Within hours, the videos had millions of views, stitched into reactions where people shouted, clapped, or simply sat in stunned silence before whispering, "She said what we've all been waiting to hear." Memes followed fast. Images of Crockett leaning into the microphone became the new template for takedowns. Kavanaugh's bewildered expression was plastered with captions like, "When entitlement meets reality," or "That moment you realize privilege isn't enough." The internet had turned the solemn hearing into a digital coliseum, and Crockett was the undisputed victor. Celebrities joined in, amplifying the moment to audiences far beyond politics. Actors, musicians, and athletes shared the clip with messages of support. One popular singer tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave us the definition of courage." A Hollywood director posted, "If this isn't in a documentary someday, it should be." Even sports stars weighed in, comparing her composure to a championship performance under pressure. Commentators, too, took notice. Progressive outlets hailed Crockett as the voice America needed, dissecting her argument line by line with admiration. Even some centrist commentators admitted they had rarely seen a sitting justice so thoroughly dismantled in public. On cable news, panelists replayed the moment over and over, some grinning as they described the hearing as a masterclass in constitutional clarity, while others whispered about the long-term implications of such a high-profile takedown. But it wasn't only the media elites who carried the message. Activists on the ground seized the energy, reframing it as more than a viral clip. It was fuel for organizing. Groups advocating for voting rights, criminal justice reform, and immigrant protections began weaving Crockett's words into their speeches. Protest signs appeared overnight bearing her quote, "Neutrality without justice is not law." Rallies in cities from Atlanta to Los Angeles echoed with chants that drew directly from her exchange with Kavanaugh. At one demonstration, a young activist held a megaphone and shouted, "Guardians protect the people." The crowd roared back, "Not themselves." The line, once a single sentence in a tense chamber, had become a call and response for a movement. Ordinary people felt it too. In living rooms and classrooms, families replayed the clip, pointing out the power of calm truth spoken against arrogance. Teachers incorporated the moment into civics lessons, asking students what neutrality and justice should really mean in America. Parents shared the video with their children, framing it as proof that voices like theirs could stand tall against even the highest levels of power. And the ripple effect only grew deeper. Donations surged to grassroots organizations connected to Crockett's district. Volunteers signed up to knock on doors, energized by the sense that something larger was taking shape. For many, it wasn't just about Crockett. It was about the possibility she represented. The idea that when someone refuses to be silenced, the silence of others can break too. This wasn't just a hearing, it became a movement. A movement where law students replayed her lines before exams as motivation. A movement where immigrants saw their struggles reflected in her insistence that the Constitution must serve everyone. A movement where those long dismissed by power finally saw someone stand toe-to-toe with it and win. The nation had witnessed more than a debate. It had witnessed a transformation, a reminder that truth spoken boldly could ripple far beyond a single room. And as the days passed, it became clear this was not a fleeting viral clip, but a cultural landmark. And yet, the most important lesson was still to come.
In the days after the hearing, as the dust settled and the viral clip spread across every corner of the internet, Jasmine Crockett's words refused to fade. They echoed not only because they were sharp, not only because they dismantled arrogance, but because they carried something deeper, a moral clarity that felt rare in the time of noise. Crockett herself seemed to understand this. When asked later about the confrontation, she didn't bask in the headlines or gloat over her rivals' faltering responses. Instead, she widened the frame. "This was never about me versus Judge Kavanaugh," she said. "It was about truth versus distortion, dignity versus arrogance, the people versus power." Those words reframed the entire debate. What the world had witnessed wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a revelation of values. Kavanaugh embodied entitlement, the belief that status alone conferred authority. Crockett embodied service, the belief that authority means nothing unless it is wielded on behalf of others. That contrast resonated because it was bigger than the two of them. In Crockett's calm dismantling of arrogance, people saw a reflection of their own struggles.
Workers ignored by corporations, immigrants dismissed by bureaucracy, citizens drowned out by moneyed interests. And in her composure, they saw hope, that truth, when spoken with conviction, could still pierce through the armor of power. This, she declared in one interview, is what America looks like when truth refuses to be silenced. The line became its own refrain, repeated in news segments, stitched into social media posts, even printed on protest banners. It was more than a soundbite. It was a creed, a reminder that the nation's story is still being written, and that silence is never the final word. The inspirational crescendo was undeniable. People who had felt invisible saw themselves in her defiance. Communities who had carried wounds of exclusion heard affirmation that their dignity mattered. And for a moment, the noise of division quieted under something stronger, the collective recognition that justice is not abstract, but alive in the voices that demand it. It wasn't just Crockett's victory. It was ours. Ours in the sense that every person who has ever been dismissed, demeaned, or underestimated could feel the surge of validation in her words. Ours because her triumph was proof that courage can bend even the most rigid displays of entitlement. Ours because in that chamber, history had tilted ever so slightly toward justice. And still, she reminded the nation that victory is never permanent. Justice requires vigilance. Dignity requires persistence. The Constitution, she said, isn't just a document we inherit. It's a promise we must keep alive. That reminder grounded the celebration. It told people that while her confrontation was extraordinary, it was also a call to keep demanding, to keep speaking, to keep insisting that truth does not whisper, but roars. The moral lesson was simple, yet profound. Arrogance crumbles under dignity. Entitlement shrinks before service, and power without truth is powerless in the end. As Crockett's words reverberated through the nation, one thought lingered in the minds of those watching. If one woman's clarity could shift the room, what could happen if millions carried that same clarity into their daily lives? That was the real victory, the spark of belief that change is not only possible, but already unfolding. And for those still doubting, the final words sealed it.
The moment we witnessed Jasmine Crockett standing firm, educating Brett Kavanaugh on the very Constitution he claimed to master was more than a hearing. It was a reckoning. It was the instant America realized this wasn't just another debate on law and precedent. This was dignity standing against arrogance, truth rising above entitlement. That's why the video you've just experienced carries weight far beyond the chamber. It's not just about one congresswoman and one justice. It's about all of us, about the nation we are still building, and about the refusal to let power silence principle. Crockett showed that clarity and courage are still possible in the heart of Washington, and that when they appear, they can ignite millions. But here's the truth. Moments like this don't spread unless we carry them. That's where you come in. If you believe in justice over cowardice, if you believe in truth over distortion, if you believe that voices like Crockett's deserve to be amplified, then be part of this movement. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and let others know that the fight for dignity is alive. Every click, every share, every voice added strengthens the roar. Because this is not the end. This is the beginning of a chorus, one that says the Constitution belongs to all of us, that justice isn't reserved for the privileged few, and that when truth speaks, it cannot be ignored. So join us. Stand with those who refuse to bow to arrogance. Carry this moment forward, and never forget, in the end, justice isn't a whisper.